Hi everyone, this is Gail Peter Borden, and I'm coming to you from my studio in Houston, Texas, to answer some questions about my upcoming show, Figured Frames at Galleri Urbane. As you may or may not know, I've been very interested in the idea of composition of perspectival depth within a very controlled figure. For the last 20 years, I've worked almost exclusively within orthogonal, either square or rectangular frames. All the compositions of these works have employed interior perspectives, occasionally with an externalization of the composition through the aggregation of individual units or canvases, allowing a piece to build into a larger form. The new work is interested in the idea of actually engaging how the perspective itself could formulate the boundary of the canvas, and how the ability for the form of the compositional perimeter could allow the internal organization to complement the external framing device to engage the wall in the space in which the work is exhibited. I think the title comes from, again, this new chapter, which allows the actual perimeter composition of the frame itself to become as equal kind of partner in the construction of the work. That allows the piece to not just be a kind of traditional orthogonal portal into another world, but actually collaborate the edge condition with those ideas of constructed space. So unlike maybe the limitations of looking through a frame of a photographic lens, which always gives a kind of datum component that frames in a very regimented way, which I would argue the work had kind of previously subscribed to. I think the new work is maybe more spatial and thus maybe sculptural, in that, again, the figure is allowing the composition to expand beyond the idea of an internal landscape, and by doing so becomes more object, not just composition on surface. So the traditions of the kind of deep frame, the resin surface, which creates reflections and a kind of a doppelganger of the viewer, as well as the context of the space reflected in the surface of the work itself. Now the form, too, is engaging the wall. And so the idea of edge becomes much more ambiguous, as less of an internal landscape, and now maybe one of a more overt presence in the larger figure and shape of the room itself. I think this has always been a kind of dialectic of an idea between a truly a two-dimensional work, which is compositionally based and ultimately exists in the planarity of a surface, right? So it's a painting, or even almost a kind of drawing like of painting, but the perception has always created a kind of sense of depth. So based upon understanding of composition, the ability for the work to begin to imply a sort of relative idea of space has always been there. Thus, the idea of calling them space frames, of the kind of iterative ways in which they've been serially displayed, either in aggregate panels or serialized layers, or just within a portal itself. They've always had a kind of interiority, but that interiority is always then projected back into the viewer, into the way in which you see the work and the way in which you personally perceive the work. So the kind of biological self and our understanding of, through sensorial sort of both limitations and kind of complexities of our own identities, physical identities, allowing for composition to begin to sort of challenge a sort of idea of absence and presence, where things become perceptually there, but in actuality are perhaps not, and thus become potentially sort of psychological spaces. They become ideas of form which are not manifest, but they are intrinsically sort of dimensional. So I like kind of the idea of interiority and externality, perhaps, in the work. I think it's always existed in that there was always a juxtaposition of self to object, but I'm hoping that with the new work and the ambiguity now of the kind of compositional frame beginning to establish a larger presence, and thus a kind of deeper engagement with the idea of wall and with the understanding of perception within the broader space in which the work is installed, now starts to truly grab hold of that externality, and the question of what the piece is becomes perhaps a much larger idea about space and kind of a dialogue between the body, the object, and the place in which it exists. This is a kind of deep conversation. I think, I've always coexisted in a sort of liminal state, which is in both, but at the same time in neither. I was educated as an architect and an artist simultaneously. I've always practiced the two in a kind of conjunctive relationship. Often in the professional or even academic world, the painting has been sort of separated. In the painting world, or fine art world, the architecture has been separated. But for me, it's kind of one deeper, ongoing kind of inquiry about the idea of the sophistication of perhaps simplicity that through reduction and through the use of kind of primary elements, color, composition, juxtaposition, reflection, and materiality, to begin to create a palette which could really begin to interrogate ideas which ride between drawing, which is a representational technique of something, often in my own interest spatial, painting, which now begins to introduce color into the kind of landscape, but still with that constructed idea of drawing. But then space with an idea of the perception of three-dimensional sensibilities, of how we create an environment in which we exist or we remember, or understand. So the work is about these very quiet, calm elements, but become frames or companions or sort of conversations with our own understanding of what the composition is and what the opportunities that I think are about environment, they're about light and space and perception and systems and proportion, but they're fundamentally that kind of synthetic idea of the spatial sensibility of experience of architecture, but an understanding that they're emotive and not functional, and thus sort of perhaps pursuing a conversation about beauty, which is, I think, innately a part of art. I hope that these talks have been a useful insight into the work, and I hope that you'll be able to come see the exhibition, Figured Frames, at Galleri Urbane.